Okay, and our second author this week is Jonathan Swift. He was the master of satire in an age when satire was one of the leading uh, forms of literature. Um, so we'll take a look at Modest Proposal as an example of that. First, a little biography. As you may have read already in the Norton, he was a member of the Irish Ascendancy. That's the privileged class that supported the English that the English supported to run their colony in Ireland. His father died before he was born, and his mother moved back to England and left him to be raised by an uncle in Ireland. Um, he became a priest of the Irish Church, took a doctorate, and ultimately became Dean of St. Patrick's in Dublin. This was a position of exile in some ways for Swift because he was part of the Anglo-Irish Protestant minority, and it didn't give him a great deal of power, but actually put him in what he considered a backwater. In fact, he was bitterly disappointed that he didn't get more support from the court. William and Mary gave him some support, but Queen Anne, when she came to the throne, disliked him and was happy to have him stuck away in Ireland. In 1713, with Alexander Pope, he formed the Scriblerus Club and there wrote many of his great satires. But it was, members competed to write the wittiest satires, and so he had an audience for his writing. And of course, he became very politicized and wrote many political pamphlets that arguing for a Tory, that is a conservative position, although his Tory position was anarchic almost. It was destructive. He was writing then in the age of the Augustans. They called themselves that because they identified with Caesar Augustus of Rome and the great classics of literature written by Horace, Virgil, and others. They valued in their writing order, decorum, wit. Samuel Johnson is the key example of the Augustans' love of order and decorum. They also valued reason, and they saw theirs as the age of the Enlightenment. So this speaks also not only to the writing of the time, but to the rise of science and commerce in this age. It was also a great age of pamphlets, and this was the result of the Licensing Act that lapsed in the late 1600s, and that meant that there was little regulation on print and what people printed, and so there was a lot of anonymous pamphlets published in which people skewered each other. In fact, A Modest Proposal was first an anonymous pamphlet. It didn't have Swift's name attached to it. So let's talk about A Modest Proposal. This is an example of Juvenalian satire that's opposed to the other satirical form called Horatian. Juvenalian satire is bitter, ironic, it's full of invective, it's angry, and based in moral indignation. And this comes from the Latin satirist Juvenal, who wrote in the 1st century and critiqued his own age and time and the institutions of Rome. The text demonstrates Swift's very conservative views. As I said, he was a Tory, and he was writing as the Whigs were becoming powerful in England. This pamphlet demands justice, and justice, not independence for Ireland. It's a country he felt was suffering from persecution, but he didn't think it would do any good for the country to be independent. So let's just touch on a key critiques that are present in the proposal, and then I just want to focus really on the critique of science. Swift skewered the Anglo-Irish landlords because they extracted wealth from Ireland and never put money back into the country. They spent it elsewhere. And the text invites us to sympathize with the poor, but it's important to remember that Swift was a conservative and he didn't have a great deal of sympathy for the poor. He was more appalled by the landlords than he was sympathetic for the sufferers. And he was very critical of the Irish. He describes the Irish as begging, thieving, wife-beating, and this is also in his sermons, not just in this text. And ultimately, this satire sort of plays off of the old slur that the Irish devour each other, and this is repeated, you might want to know, in James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist in the 20th century. So it's an ongoing slur about the Irish, and something you should definitely consider in an Irish lit class. Finally, Swift is always aware that satire does not affect any great change in society. And for this, you might want to also look at the YouTube video I put up. I don't know if it's YouTube, but Jon Stewart talking to the BBC4 about satire, along with other satirists of our age. Okay, so I want to look specifically at Swift's mocking of 18th century science and commerce. A Modest Proposal is written in the persona of an English economist, someone who embraces the rationalist principles of Adam Smith and free enterprise, which are coming to the fore in the 18th century. And it's important that you realize that it's not entirely likely that Swift would have approved of such a persona. This is a sort of social scientist, but it allows him to skewer Enlightenment fascination with numbers and scientific logic and the modern science in general and the rise of commerce. So he's kind of setting himself up to critique the upper classes through a persona that he doesn't admire either. So he's kind of letting everybody have it in this text. It might help you to consider what David Cody, another scholar, says about Swift and science. He points out that he lived in a time when a great deal of what passed for science was, at best, pseudo-science. So he was not anti-intellectual, but he was passionately opposed to the useless follies of charlatans, quacks, cheats, speculators, and virtuosi. And so it's most likely that the persona who's offering this modest proposal is just one of these charlatans. I mean, clearly he's proposing state-sponsored cannibalism, so he's not someone Swift is likely to admire. But in creating this persona, Swift can mock not only the English landlords and the Irish poor, but also then the pseudo-scientists of his day. So here's a couple examples then of what I'm talking about. We see him skewering scientists in their science in various ways. Consider, for example, this quote from the text. The number of souls in this kingdom being usually reckoned at 1.5 million, of these I calculate there may be about 200,000 couple whose wives are breeders, from which number I subtract 30,000 couples who are able to maintain their own children, although I apprehend there cannot be so many under the present distresses of the kingdom. But this being granted, there will remain 170,000 breeders. So my question is, how is this mocking pseudoscience? And clearly it's mocking the sort of fascination with numbers and quantifying and categorizing things. But you could also probe it more deeply and capture the ways in which his mockery is present. Or consider another quote where he's listing the 6 benefits of his proposal. And this is clearly pseudoscience or pseudo-reason, you choose. First, and I've cut this down considerably. For first, it would greatly lessen the number of papists or Catholics. Secondly, the poorer tenants will have something valuable of their own, which by law may be liable to distress and help to pay their landlord's rent. Thirdly, the nation's stock will thereby be increased £50,000 per annum, besides the profit of a new dish. Fourthly, the constant breeders will be rid of the charge of maintaining them, their children, after the first year. Or, sorry, maintaining them, and I put in their children. So, in other words, you see this list of benefits as if it's perfectly reasonable, mocking reason, because clearly these reasons are absurd. Oops, so I ended. So let me just say then that as we talk about Jonathan Swift on the discussion board, it'll be useful to perhaps tease out the various ways he uses language and style to either mock the upper classes, which, as I said, is the sort of key thrust of the argument, or critiques reason and science. Okay, see you on the discussion board.